Well, I don't think it's crank exegesis at all. And I never used the words Casper the Ghost. I'm assuming that was his commentary on what I have argued. That actually isn't any argument I've ever made. Now, let's cut to the chase. Now, the main point of contention here, this is one thing that he's conceded, or at least hasn't argued, is that the epistles don't actually mention a missing body. They don't actually tell us what happened that the Christians would believe regarding the empty tomb. We don't know if anyone went there. The epistles don't tell us. All they talk about are visions, and as I established from the epistles, the Christians were regularly hallucinating. So we know from natural science what that probably means as far as where they're getting their information about the resurrection of Jesus, and that they would actually hallucinate Jesus telling them he had been risen from the dead, and from that they would actually believe the tomb was empty, or they would believe that he exchanged bodies. We don't actually know. So let's get to the Gospels. Now, he says I'm engaging in crank exegesis of the Gospels. Well, I think you can judge that for yourself. I mean, what are the odds of all of the particular coincidences I point out in there? This is not that unusual. He particularly attacks my theory, which I actually didn't present here today, that the three women who come to the tomb are actually symbolic. The argument is much more elaborate, and the basis of it, which actually makes it plausible, is the implausibility, the improbability of the coincidences that are involved. He just mentions one, and he tries to make it sound more ridiculous than it really is, which is that Mary of Magdala, represents Mary in association with Migdal. It's actually Magdala is Migdal. It's not an extended argument that I have to get to make that point. It actually is Mary of Magdala, which is the Migdal, which is the place where we draw the parallels from. But there's also Salome, which is the female name of Solomon, and the other Mary, who is the Mary, the mother of Jacob, which is the Mary, the mother of Israel, and so on. Whether all of this is plausible or not, you can judge for yourself. I argue it in Not the Impossible Faith, where I have a more extended discussion of it than I do in The Empty Tomb. But that's not really the convincing bit to me, actually. That's something that I look for and I think is actually plausible after I've already discovered elements of the thing that I find are highly improbable and look like actual symbolic messages. As I've pointed out, this is symbolic fiction. The Cleopas narrative, for example, is a clear case of this. The Barabbas narrative, I think, is a clear case of this. The improbability of these things, as history makes no sense, but as deliberate fiction makes complete sense. Now, Mark's use of the empty tomb narrative. Let me get to that. In 2 Chronicles 16, Mark links Jesus with King Asa, who also famously reformed the Jerusalem cult, by linking the burial to spices, using the same word, and by calling the tomb's doorstone very great, just as the spices burned for Asa's funeral were very great. And by introducing the tomb with the same phrase, and by calling it hewn from the rock, just as Asa's tomb is called. Genesis 29, when the women say, "Who will roll away the stone?" Mark copies a phrase from the Genesis narrative of Jacob's fathering of the 12 tribes of Israel, also spoken by a woman, followed by the opening of Jacob's well to bring the water of life to the sheep. Psalm 24 begins with the phrase, "on the first from the Sabbaths," a rather strange phrase that we don't find very many times in ancient literature. It means on the first day, but it's worded very strangely. This is the exact same phrase that Mark uses to begin his empty tomb narrative, and yet Psalm 24 is the only passage in the Greek Old Testament that contains this phrase. By choosing this phrase, instead of the more familiar phrase, "on the third day," Mark is pointing us to Psalm 24, which speaks of a righteous man receiving salvation from the Lord. In the exact same way, he calls our attention to Psalm 23 for the crucifixion of Jesus, with Jesus' cry on the cross, "Lord, Lord, why have you forsaken me?" quoting the exact same Aramaic that comes from the Psalm 23, verbatim. Mark actually follows a 3-psalm liturgy in his formation of the death, burial, and empty tomb narratives. He uses Psalm 22 to construct the story of Jesus' crucifixion. Psalm 22 is the one that has the cry on the cross quoted verbatim. Then Psalm 23 aligns with his burial, since it's the well-known funeral psalm. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," etc. Then Psalm 24 speaks of opening the door and the righteous man ascending to the Lord's house, which Mark turns into an allusion to opening the tomb and ascending to heaven. I don't think this is implausible at all. I think it's very improbable that you would have all of these conjunction of things. Ecclesiastes 4 and Mark 16, the women journey beneath the sun to anoint their king, Jesus, but find a young man in his place, and as a result they fail to rejoice. That's Mark's story. In Ecclesiastes, the living walk under the sun with a young man who stands in the place of the king, yet the last people in the story failed to rejoice. The elements are almost identical with similar concepts and wording. I find this very improbable. I'm just telling you how it looks to me. Now, there are many other things I could point out like this. Let's talk about the naked boy in Mark. Yeah, did you know there's a naked boy in Mark? Mark mentions an anonymous young man in Greek in neaniskos exactly twice. At Jesus' arrest, this young boy has his linen garment torn off him and he runs away naked. Then at the empty tomb, by the way, that's a weird element of the story to add, but it's in there. So why is it in there? That's a good question. At the empty tomb, we see a young boy, exact same word, neaniskos, appears dressed in white. It is almost certainly meant to be the same boy. The same word is used twice in only those two places, and there's no other reason for those two, or for the first element to be there except to prepare us for the second. This person is never named, yet twice plays a conspicuous role in the story. Now, linen garments were a common metaphor for the body of flesh. Nakedness was a common metaphor for dying and being naked without a body. Garments of white were a common metaphor for angelic and resurrected bodies. So the young man is thus a symbol of the Christian who will undergo the same sequence, dying, losing their body, becoming naked, and then donning a new superior body at the resurrection. Now, I'm not reading this into the text. It's there. It seems fairly obvious to me that the probability of this is very low, of being it there just by accident, and I just am seeing things like some sort of psycho on my own. Now, the placement of this boy is also significant. Mark says he stands inside the tomb and thus in the land of the dead, on the right, exactly matching a common salvation narrative in pagan mystery cult, in which a white cypress stands to the right in the land of the dead as a marker to the initiate that he was not to stop but to go beyond. Those who go beyond find the water of life, which is called the water of remembrance, while those who stay drink the water of death. So it's not a likely coincidence that this white-clad boy stands on the right inside a tomb called in the Greek a memorial, and then asks the woman to remember something they were told and tells them what they're looking for is not there, just as the initiate is told the same, but they must go beyond to find it, it being the very same thing mystery cultists were looking for, eternal life. Hence, Mark closely mimics this mystery narrative in both details and meaning. Now, I want to reiterate that had Jesus actually risen from the dead by God, that he could appear to everyone, and he would have if he actually wanted everyone to be saved. It's not enough to say that God has an excuse for not appearing to people. The point is, if he wanted everyone to be saved, the obvious thing for him to do that he could have done is to appear to everyone. The fact that he only appeared to a few people is strange on that theory, but it makes complete sense on the theory that these are just hallucinations by primed believers, and even Paul, as an outsider, was also primed to come to the same conclusion, and he is alone, actually. There's no other enemies of the church that were converted to join the church. Now, this idea that the Romans would heed crowds' wishes and not release traitors and murderers, his evidence doesn't support that. The particular case he's talking about is not a traitor and not a murderer. There's no evidence that the Romans would ever release such a prisoner, much less, and this is the important point, there's no evidence of this being a custom on the Jewish holiday. That is a particular flag. What custom on the Jewish holiday is Mark talking about? Well, the analogy is clear that he's talking about the Yom Kippur. Even though he's not putting this on Yom Kippur, he's clearly talking about the actual ceremony that takes place every year at Yom Kippur, exactly as Mark says it takes place every year on the holiday. And I showed the analysis of that. Now, he says that what motivated Matthew to include the Jewish polemic of the theft, what motivated Matthew to create the guards at the tomb or to create that story was the Jewish accusation of theft. Oh, I can't get to that, so I'm out of time. Thank you.